We are here filming some very important interviews with jazz musicians for an archive to be held at Hamilton College. And it's our great privilege to have Red Holloway with us. My name is Dr. Michael Woods, and my associate is Monk Rowe. Monk, would you like to start things here?
Well, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be here. We've had some interesting conversations with some other fine musicians, and Red Holloway has been in our list, and we're glad to have him here as an alto and tenor saxophonist. And wondered, one thing we're interested in is how jazz has changed over the years for you, what made you want to get into music as a kid, and just some things about your own career that you could share with us.
Well, see, I'll be 68 years old this year. And when I was a kid, you could either be a Pullman porter, you could become a barber. If your folks had money, you might be able to become a doctor. But if you had no talents and you were nice looking, you could become a pimp. So, but basically most men became Pullman porters, you see.
Yeah.
So I had none of those qualifications. And since my mother was a pianist, my father played violin, I decided maybe I should try to be a musician. But now I always liked boxing because, you know, like Sugar Ray and Joe Louis, they would, you know, they were my idols, you know. And a friend of mine, we went to school together named Johnny Bratton. We used to be in the gym together all the time. We used to run 5 miles a day for 10 years. I started about 8 or 9 years old, and he became, well, we were amateur boxers, and he became a champion boxer. I don't know if you're familiar with Johnny Bratton, but he won one of those titles from Kid Gavilan from Cuba back in the 50s. But anyway, we were close friends. And I used to do this for a while, but I always liked music, you know. But after about 37 amateur fights and getting my head smashed in, I really decided I should be a musician.
Healthy decision.
There were no, see, during those days, those were some real bad days back in the latter 30s and early 40s, and, well, the middle 40s. It was mean. So if you played music, there wasn't a lot of money involved. They paid like, well, you made $2.50 an hour as a musician. And like when you were making $6 a night and all you can eat and drink, that was good, good money. So basically, that's when I decided. I really wanted to be a musician. And even though the money wasn't an awful lot, but it didn't, you know, there wasn't a requirement. The cost of living was down, so you didn't have to pay a lot of money. You could rent a house for like, $20 a month and stuff like that. And it was very cheap. Of course, it didn't cost, you didn't make a lot of money, but it didn't cost a lot of money. In fact, my first job that I ever had, period, was as a busboy for $9.98. Well, actually, it's $10. They took out 2 cents for Social Security, but $9.98 a week, 7 days a week, 7 till 7.
Oh, my God.
Wow. So I'm just saying, this is back in the 40s, you know, so like, this is why I decided to be a musician. And so far, I've managed to keep doing this. And I was raised in Chicago. I was born in Helena, Arkansas. But, you know, in Chicago, this was where everybody from the South and everywhere, they would come to Chicago first, and eventually they would move on to New York. And when I first really started making some, well, what I call serious money, I was working with Eugene Wright. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He was the bass player.
Played with Brubeck later, didn't he?
Yeah. Senator Eugene Wright. I was in high school, and he called me to work with his band. In fact, I worked with his band until I went to the service. So, like, there were a lot of different reasons why I wanted to play music.
Did you have a hero? Did you have somebody on your particular instrument that you liked their sound?
Yeah, Lester Young. You know, the first thing I started was with the clarinet, because Benny Goodman and Lionel Hampton, and they were working with Benny Goodman, and I wanted to play clarinet, which I did for a while in school. But when I heard Lester Young and The World Is Mad, I didn't want no parts of a clarinet. I wanted to play saxophone. So basically, that's what I went to. There was a school teacher, a music teacher at DeSauler High School called Captain Walter Dye. And like Johnny Griffin went, well, we were in the same band together at the time. When he graduated in '45, went with him. And then there was Benny Green, the trombone player. And even Gene Ammons took a few courses from him. So he was a very, very important person in my life and a lot of other musicians' lives. So that's basically how I started really playing music for a living.
Was being in Chicago that time was a big blues town?
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Was that, did you feel that influence in your own
and
playing?
how? Let me tell you. I don't know if you, well, I'm sure you're probably familiar with Willie Dixon, and well, he used to write a lot of songs, and he had a trio called the Big Three Trio, because both of them, all three of them weighed about 300 pounds or more apiece. And I knew him very well. In fact, when he went with Cobra Records, myself and Hal Ashby was his favorite saxophone players. In fact, I just picked up a reissue of the Cobra label things that was done during that era in the 50s of Cobra Records. And I got a lot of CDs that Hal Ashby and myself were on with Willie Dixon. And of course, Willie Dixon used to write a lot of stuff for Muddy Waters and Coco Taylor. And I played with all the blues players. In fact, Sunnyland Slim, Memphis Slim. In fact, I just finished an album last year with Etta James called Mystery Lady. She just got a Grammy for it just a few days ago. So I've been playing, and Ruth Brown. I played with Ruth Brown. She got her first Grammy. I played with Joe Williams. He got his first, in fact, I was a band lead on that session. He got his first Grammy. So, I mean, I've been working with a lot of blues players, you know. And I feel if you don't know how to play the blues, you really don't know too much about music. Technique don't mean nothing if you don't have no feeling. You know, if you ain't got no soul, forget about it.
In other words, it don't mean a thing.
If it ain't got that swing, you know. And I don't say every song has to be soulful, but I mean, it should have a feeling. Music is supposed to be something that's beautiful and something that people can feel, you know. And when it loses its feeling and beauty, that was one of the things that really kind of inspired me from Coleman Hawkins and Lester Young, because of the fact that they just had so much feeling. And then when I heard Ben Webster, I said, oh, sure. You know, like, this dude was just like a big gorilla. But when he picked up that saxophone, he was just like some women used to call him their prince. But he was, you know, it's funny how they always say, which is true, you can't judge a book by its cover. Because, like, you look at a person, you say, dang, this sucker here, what the hell can he play? I mean, he look like he should be pouring iron, you know. And then when they start to playing or something, I'll give you a good example, like Oscar Peterson, he's such a big man, you know, you would say, oh, what kind of music could he play? But when he sits down at the piano, you say, wow, you can tell that there has been a lot of study going on there, and there has been a lot of thinking, you know. And see, now today, when I was growing up, you couldn't, there were no jazz studies. Now, I went to Chicago Conservatory, but everything was classical. But now they got schools where you can go and learn to play jazz. Now, I don't mean that you necessarily can be a great jazz player, but you will know all of the necessary things that you should know.
You can become proficient.
Yeah. And so the thing of it is, it's something that you have to feel. And I was around more blues players. In fact, my mother and Roosevelt Sykes went to school together. And my first gig on the road was with Roosevelt Sykes for a year in 1948. I went all over the U.S. with him. So now when you playing the blues every night, you can't help but, you know the blues and feel the blues. So that was one of that's really how I got started, and
It's still part of your playing today.
Yeah. I still love the blues.
Can you describe what a typical recording session might have been like for one of the blues artists? Because today we're familiar with how bands sometimes spend weeks and months making records, and they make them in sections, and they overdub.
And they do the rhythm section first, and then they do the solo tracks after that, and all this intricate mixing.
That is so ridiculous. That is just really stupid. And I don't care who hears it, that's stupid. That's just a waste of time and money. The way we used to do, and the way I still do myself, is what I'll do is like, and when I was working with Brother Jack McDuff, even John Mayall, now he's a British, father of the British blues. I worked with him. We would rehearse the stuff at his house, all the changes that had to be made. Then we would play it on some jobs. We'd play it maybe for a month. And I still do that. And McDuff, we'd play our stuff for maybe 2 or 3 months, and it would be, in fact, when I made the first record with McDuff, him and George Benson and Joe Duke had been playing together for a couple of years. And I had joined him, like, his saxophone player had to go down south because somebody had died in the family. And I joined his band, like, at 3 o'clock that day. And we rehearsed from 3 until about 6, the stuff that he was going to do. And we went to the studio, and they had an audience, and the audience had been drinking from 6 until 8. That's when the session was starting. And basically, everyone knew the music except myself, you know. But I went and rehearsed with him that day, and I wrote down I was playing more or less the melodic lines. So it made it rather easy, whereas George and McDuff was playing the harmony. So when we went to the session that night, it was perfect. The people, they got high, and they had been drinking and eating barbecued ribs and just having a good time. And so they were high and loose. And that was the album Live at the Front Room. And when it came out, it was a hit.
Wow.
And that's really what started the whole thing off. So like, even when I worked with John Mayall, we would practice the stuff and we'd play it on gigs. Then we'd go in the studio, and it'd take maybe 5 hours to do an album. But I mean, this is stupid, going in, well, one of the things, they don't have anything prepared. That's usually what it is. Most of the groups of today that tie up a studio for 2 and 3 months cost $150,000, $200,000. That is stupid. And because usually most of them don't really know anything about the instruments. In fact, there was a girls group, and they had this hit. And the fella was interviewing them, and he said, well, now what is your next thing that you're going to do? You got this big hit, whatever the name it was. And so they said, well, we're going and try and learn how to play these instruments. And I mean, this was on television. I said, well, I'll be done.
Things have changed.
Well, you know, my daughter, she says, like, people are getting so accustomed to just mediocre stuff, they don't know good shit when they hear it.
I was going to come with something behind that, and I was going to ask you, you know, a jazz musician, sometimes people challenge jazz musicians to think that, oh, they're just somehow winging stuff off the top of the head. And I tell them, I said, anybody that can play 2 32-bar choruses for 64 bars with wonderful burning ideas is a theoretician. Am I right? You can't play this music and play it well with all the lines where they're supposed to be, and the motivic development and the turns and articulations without being a theoretician.
Right. That's right. You're so right. You have got to sit and figure it out. Now, some people have a great knack for that. Some people are just what you call naturals, you know. I mean, they have, well, Earl Garner's a good one. You know, he didn't really have the training, but he sat down at that piano enough and studied and taught himself enough that he knew what to put where and when. So that's why I say you got some people that are just naturally musically inclined, and they are able to do certain things like that. Then you got some. I had a cousin, because I was taking piano lessons. He went and took piano lessons for 5 years, and today he can't play anything. In fact, he could only play what he read, and now he can't do that. So I'm just saying, some people do not have that particular type, that knack that you need, that certain talent that you need to do certain things. And then you have some that really don't. Well, Benny Green, he would only study when he had to. Great trombone player. He may not play for 4 or 5 months, pick up his trombone like he just played it an hour ago. You know, some people are just like that. Gene Ammons, he's another, but Gene studied. But one of the things, I mean, he had just his sound was really one of the great things about his playing, as well as his articulation and stuff. Nevertheless, his sound was really, that's one of the things I was taught, says, one of the things you get first for identification is a sound. Your own sound. Now, if you're going to copy somebody else, if you're going to copy how they play, at least get your own sound. Don't copy their tone also, you know. Because if everyone sounds alike, then it's, you know, it's just like making photocopies. Everything looking sounds alike, you know. So that was one of the things that I always thought about, and I always tried to practice so that I wouldn't sound like anyone else. Of course, now I always like Ben Webster, and I always like those, you know, those beautiful sounds, but I would try and do it, but I would try and do it with my own sound.
In other words, it was okay to be influenced by somebody, and okay to try and do some of what they did conceptually, but not note for note.
Yeah, definitely. And another something too is, now in order for me to learn how to drive a car, I have to take instruction from you and do what you do. But after I learn how to drive, then I drive my own way. So that's what they always say. You know, you might have to copy someone in order to learn how to articulate or how to phrase well. You know, if you see somebody that you like. But after that, after you learn that, then get your own thing so that people will say, oh, this is so-and-so and so-and-so. And then, you know, you'll have your own identity.
Do you think there are young students out today that emulate you?
Listen, you know what? I don't know. There's a friend of mine in Los Angeles says there's a young fellow. He says he sounds like you. I said, well, no, he doesn't have the sound. He said, no, but the stuff that he plays in the phrasing. He said Ricky Woodard. I can't see it, but I listen to Ricky, and this saxophone player's name, Wilbur Brown. Wilbur Brown is a hell of a saxophone player. He lives in L.A. But he says Ricky Woodard sounds like you. I said, well, not for the tone. I said maybe he might have like some of the ideas. Yeah. Now I tell you we sound pretty close, Johnny Griffin and I, because of the fact. One of the things about when I was young coming up, if I heard something on the radio and I copied it, I would call you up and say, man, listen, meet me over so-and-so, I'll be right over. And I'd show you this lick that I learned from maybe Don Byers or whoever it was, you know, Charlie Parker, and I would teach it to you. And when you learned something, you'd call me up and tell me about it. And so we all did that, you know. I mean, trumpet players, trombone player, didn't really matter, you know. But today, you can ask a young musician something. Well, you know, he go off into some other stuff, and you never get an answer. So I don't know, as though it's a closely guarded secret about something.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about, you know, there's different places in the country where ideas seem to gel collectively for musicians.
Mm-hmm.
And Milt Phileas asked us to ask you about Central Avenue and the things that were going on and the people that you played with.
Well, actually, I never played on Central Avenue, but I was very aware of it. See, like I said, I was raised in Chicago. When I got to California, I got to California in the 60s, like in 67. But I had been to California in 1962 and 63 with Lloyd Price's band. But I never got on Central Avenue when it really was Central Avenue, you know, when it really had a lot of, like Central Avenue Breakdown by Lionel Hampton, you know. In fact, I was in New York before I got to California. I went to New York in 1946 when I was in the service. I was in Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. And on my first weekend, I went to New York City. And looking on 52nd Street, looking at this club and that club, and man, let me tell you, you know, I almost stopped playing. You hear music, and I mean, this is when Bird and Diaz and Earl Garner and everybody was on the street, and you hear real music, you know. And I was still honking at that time.
Wow.
I was playing the Ornette Cobb and that type, you know,
Yeah.
that type of saxophone. So, and I heard all these changes and things. I said, I'll never be able to play like that. So I almost quit. But, you know, there's something, if you love music, you just say, well, I'm going to have to learn how to do this regardless.
Yeah.
Because I certainly don't want to be working in no foundry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember when I got out of the service, I went to work in the Pullman Manufacturing Company. This was where they built the Vistadome. You know, like when you take a Amtrak, you can look out the observation car. You know, well, I worked on the first one of those, and boy, after about a month of that, I said, no, I think I'm gonna stick with this music.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that really kind of put me on the straight and narrow. Sure.
Can you tell us any thing about your work with Joe Williams?
Yeah, you know, like I met Joe way back. In fact, I wish I had thought about it. There's a clipping I could have bought from Club de Lisa in Chicago, and it was Joe Williams, "Stop Pretty Baby Stop," that song that he did. It's a little clipping from Club de Lisa. I was working with what was her name? Little Miss Corn Shucks. I was working at de Lisa with her, and it was just the whole advertisement of Joe Williams and what, you know, with whom he was working, Red Saunders, and so. But like I met him way back years ago in Chicago, and he was gigging like we all would be. We'd work our regular gig during the week. Then on Monday morning they would have what you call a breakfast dance. Now every club would have, like Club de Lisa, it would go all night Sunday night, and they would have a breakfast dance from let's see, it would start at 6 o'clock and go until 8 o'clock.
Wow.
Anybody that was playing anywhere in Chicago, I mean, all musicians. This place held 1,000 people. It was called Club de Lisa. Red Saunders has been there for about 30 years. And Joe Williams worked there for quite a few years. Billy Eckstein worked. A lot of your name entertainers worked at this club because they had chorus girls. They had 8 chorus girls. They had a 9-piece band, and they had comedians. I mean, these were real shows. You don't get real shows today. You get one singer after another. But like you had tap dancers, you had comedians, you had novelty acts, Butterbeans and Susie, and and you know, Peg Leg Bates. You had a real collection of people to make up a show. The show would run maybe an hour and a half, you know. But then when they would finish, then the band would play for a half an hour, and people would dance. You know, the stage would go up for the show, and when the show was over, the stage would come down, and people would go and dance. I mean, it was a big affair, and the place would be jam-packed every Monday morning. Then when you left the Club de Lisa, you would go to other clubs, and the jam sessions would start Monday morning till the next morning, about 5 a.m. Tuesday morning.
Wow.
I mean, every club had something happening, you know. So what would happen, I used to see Joe. He might be working at the Lisa, and then he would probably go over to maybe over on 39th Street or to the DuSable Hotel or some of those different places, and maybe do a gig or something, you know. And everybody would meet up at a certain place and have breakfast. And during those days, the popular food was brains and eggs. Of course, I know you wouldn't think of that today, but you go have brains and eggs and biscuits and stuff like that. And you'd hang out and talk stuff all morning, you know. So Chicago really was, I mean, like Dexter Gordon and Sonny Stitt and Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, everybody would be in town. You would have the Dorsey brothers and Harry James, but everyone would come to this particular club. So that's what I have, this club with Joe on it. And there were a few occasions where we would run across each other, because I'd work the Regal Theater, which was the theater that had all the different shows, you know. And like Count Basie's band would come there, Duke Ellington, and they would still have a complete stage show with comedians and dancers and stuff. And Joe would work a lot of these different. So, you know, in your course of playing from this place to the other, you'd be playing with him, and I met him years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah. He was light enough to ride a duck.
That's a good phrase.
But you know, one of the things, he always had a different type of voice than most vocalists. I mean, his voice, his range, and was such. He had such a great range for his voice that he could practically sing anything, opera as well as ballads. But of course, now you know, in America, the blues is always boss. I don't care. You know, it was so funny when I used to work with Lloyd Price. The band would play. He had like a 14-piece band. Now James Brown had a 7-piece band. Ray Charles had a 8 or 9-piece band, and I used to work at Lloyd Price, and we would play at Small's Paradise in New York. So Lloyd Price would have James Brown as his guest, and then he'd have Ray Charles as his guest. But when both of them heard Lloyd's band, you know, like the band would start to playing, but we wouldn't be playing no blues to start off. We'd be playing some hip arrangements of whatever was popular for the day, you know. And so when we would finish playing and everybody done played their solos and played like mad, the audience would say, "All right, now can y'all play us some blues?"
Oh.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying, blues is the boss. But when I mentioned James Brown and Ray Charles, when they heard the band and heard what we played behind Lloyd Price, that's when they decided, this is way back in the 60s, they said, I gotta have me a band, Can't have this 7-piece. And Ray Charles sounded good with his you know, little small group. But you sound better with a big band. So they all decided to have a band. But no matter what you play, the blues is always the boss. I'm sorry to say, but it's the truth. And you know, I have this feeling for the blues. After playing with so many blues players, you kind of see, like when Guitar Murphy and all them, we used to work all, and what's his name, Collins, he's dead now,
Albert?
guitar player. What?
Albert Collins? Or?
Well, Albert Collins and Albert King and all these blues players I used to work with years ago. L.C. McKinley and the Flamingos and the Eldorados and the Moon Glows. All these people I recorded with and worked with at one time. So you have a feeling for blues.
Did you find it different to work with British blues musicians?
Well, one of the things about when you play with British musicians, they have a different concept for the blues. You know, like our blues is kind of a blues about things that happen in our life, in our lives and stuff. And we base most of our material on something happy or something unhappy or stuff like that. But when they write songs, not all of them now, it can be about anything. It can be about their car, or it could be about the bridge that they crossed last year. So it's just a little different feel. But I mean, they basically get a good blues feeling, some of them, but it's just a little different. It's not like what you're accustomed to hearing.
Can you remember or recite us a blues lyric that you like?
Oh, you better turn that machine off.
No, he told us to capture it. I said, go ahead.
Okay, well, listen, when I used to work with Roosevelt Sykes, now, they called him the original honey dripper. And in fact, I sang this song myself now, but I have to be aware of where I can't sing this song here. But Roosevelt Sykes used to do a song. His theme song, he'd say, I wanna do-do. He said, whoa, I wanna do-do. And he'd be playing do-do-do-do-do. And people look around and say, oh. He said, I wanna do-do-do what you want me to. I wanna do-do. But another song that he sang that I usually sing is like, my baby got an ice cream freezer and she let me put my milk in her can. My baby's freezer ain't to be turned by no other man.
All right.
Yeah, you know. Some folks like New York vanilla and strawberry, but black walnut's the cream I love. Because when I put my spoon in that walnut, it fits just like a rubber glove.
All right.
Now, see, here's the thing I wanted to get at. Now, when it comes time, somebody's singing that, right?
Yeah.
And it comes time for the alto sax solo. And I'm trying to tell my students in my history of jazz class about blue notes. So how you gonna play something straight after that?
That's right.
If you can't bend tones after somebody singing that, you know, golly, put the horn back in the case.
That's right. That's right. Let me tell you. Yeah. Oh, Jimmy Witherspoon, I like that line he got. I don't like the way you been acting, mama. You know you ain't treating me right. You don't have to go to the dentist tomorrow, baby, because I'm knocking out your teeth tonight. But you see, one of the things, when we write blues, there's usually some kind of, it's almost like a poem in a sense. It rhymes. If it doesn't rhyme in the next phrase, it'll rhyme in the next one after that, you know.
Right.
And it always tells a story. Now, there are a few exceptions to that rule, but they seem to still get over. John Lee, Hooker's one. I mean, he may say boom, 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 but he's got that voice, and he's got his type of rhythm that he can do that and get away with.
He sure can.
You know, and he can say anything, and it goes because of his voice and the way he pronounced. Another person that was like that, Jimmy Reed. Now, Jimmy Reed was another. He was just a master of that. But all of his stuff kind of was lyrical, and it had, it always came out. I remember trying to think where his wife was in the studio with him, and you could hear her saying the words, and he would.
Yeah.
I can't remember the name of
Bright
that.
Lights, Big City.
Yeah, and the Big Boss Man, I think, too. But she used to be in there. And see, I went on the road with Jimmy Reed in 1957, all down in Florida. And Jimmy Reed used to drank a lot of moonshine. During this period, people were dying of drinking moonshine. So we were trying to quit Jimmy Reed from drinking. So we got this newspaper, and Jimmy Reed, when he'd get to a city, he'd get him like a gallon of this White Lightning. And I mean, this stuff was so strong, it would, like if you drank it, your lips would get chapped. So, and so we started reading these, I'd read these things out loud. Yeah, 12 people died in Okeechobee, Mississippi, drinking this moonshine and stuff. Then we'd turn the radio on and it'd be so like we'd see Jimmy pouring his moonshine out the window. So I'm just saying, you know, there's so many different type things that happen on the road that's really, well, that's how you get your lyrics for songs and stuff. And these things are about life and things that really happen in people's lives, you know.
In other words, it's experiential.
Exactly.
The music that
yeah.
gives the music a certain sense of authenticity.
Yeah, yeah. So like I feel very privileged to have lived during this particular era, because a lot of the young musicians, they do no research. Well, not all of them, but a lot of them don't do any research. Now, I tell you, I had a chance to meet John Coltrane when he was with Dizzy. And I had met him before that. In fact, I met him with Eddie Cleanhead Vinson. But he, of course, he wasn't playing the way he was when he died. But he could play the blues now. I'm talking about play some real blues, you know. And on one of his recent things, he and the alto player that died.
Eric Dolphy?
No, the one that they both worked with Cannonball. I mean, that was it, Cannonball.
Oh,
Yeah.
Cannonball.
Cannonball. Now they played a blues, and let me tell you, they were playing the real funk, stomp down, knock me down blues, you know, and that's what you don't hear too much. See, so although they did play other things, they were able to play that because of the fact that they had this blues background. You know? And that's what's very important. And when you don't get a chance to experience playing the blues, you don't really have any foundation for what you play. You know, you have to have that kind of a background. And I'm sure any musicians that even anyone that your most modern blues players, jazz players will tell you that. You know, some of them don't particularly feature that in their playing, but they have that blues background that they can do it if they want to. You know, and that's what's really important.
And seems to be a difference there. I'd like you to speak on this. The difference between execution and expression.
Well, there were a few people who could execute and express themselves beautifully and make it sound very melodic and convincing and with feelings. Then you got some who play 4 million notes and you don't feel nothing and you haven't heard anything, you know. Now, Bird was one who could play, fast, and he could play a whole lot of stuff. And Sonny Stitt, Diaz, and with feeling. You know, like when Bird played with Jay McShann, you know. Man, that cat, when he get through playing some of them solos, he played 1 million notes, but they were important. They were not wasted. They were not just some notes. They were, it wasn't a whole song, but it was just between certain phrases. He'd play maybe some cadenzas there inside those different phrases. You say, God damn, how did he do that? And then he'd lean on some of those blue notes. And boy, it's just something, when you hear it, you know, you can't forget it. In fact, if you're a musician, if you hear it at night, you go home on to practice. course, now Coltrane could do that too because he had a very wonderful background with blues and stuff. And of course, after a while, you start teaching yourself. When you get the basics, then you can venture out on your own and do whatever you want to do, you know. And I must say, most of his stuff that he did, it made sense. It made great sense. A lot of people don't think so. There are some things during the experimental time that didn't make too much sense. But after he really got into the groove of what was happening and finally got his, and what was that thing he said? He said, sometimes he has so many ideas at one time, he just play them all. he said he just play them all. So, but that's great because sometimes some people can't do that. You know, some people can only play a certain select few ideas, and I think the real goal of any musician is to be able to play all of their ideas, not necessarily all together. Nevertheless, I think they should be able to express themselves musically, you know. So it's possible to play a lot of different things and still play it with feelings, I think. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Did you say you were going to Australia soon?
Yeah, I'm going in the 19th of April.
That's nice.
Yeah, well, my first trip to Australia was in '73 with John Mayall.
Uh-huh.
And in fact, Blue Mitchell and Freddie Robinson, I don't know if you're familiar with these names, but...
I remember the record. Did you make a record with him that had no drummer on it or something? I remember hearing
no.
a record of his, but I remember your name on there and Blue Mitchell.
I don't remember making one with no drummer, but we did do some peculiar things. I remember many times when I first joined him, I said, well, when are we going to rehearse? Oh, I don't have rehearsals. I said, what? You don't have no rehearsal? I said, well, what am I going to play? Oh, you'll find something. I asked Blue Mitchell, I said, man, what am I going to play? Oh, don't worry about it. You'll find something. He says the reason he doesn't rehearse is because he like for it to be spontaneous. Your ideas, he said, he don't want you to rehearse ideas to put on the song. He wants you to be able to, when you hear it, play it. That's the way he likes it. I said, fine with me. So I just played whatever I felt I wanted to play. Perfect, perfect. I said, oh, yeah? I said, that wasn't shit. But, you know, like, I noticed that the audience, they went wild. I said, I can't believe this.
Yeah.
What is this? You know, but it worked. So I said, who am I to, you know, tell another person how to make his omelet? But I must say, I enjoyed working with him. I made more money with John Mayall than any big band I ever worked with.
Yeah.
And like when we would finish a 15-week tour in Europe or wherever, he said, well, fellas, like if we were in Europe, he said, well, I'm going to Spain for 2 weeks. Anybody want to go? Come on, everything is free. You want your lady send for her? I'll pay for it. And he maybe give you a couple of grand, a bonus at the end of the tour and stuff like that.
Wow.
I mean, of course, John Mayall was a millionaire, and he was making $50,000 or $60,000 a night, so he could afford to do that, you know. And he wouldn't tell, he couldn't tell you a note big as this room, but he know chords. I mean,
Yeah.
he could write out the chords to his song, but they would be just basic chords. Wouldn't be no flat this and raise that. It would just be
basic
it
chords.
would be a C minor, or C7, or whatever. It wouldn't be nothing, no diminish this. But it was really nice, you know.
Great.
In fact, there was one other person I made a record with, and we went in and show you that how things can be done. Now this is, we went in the studio with Bill Cosby, and I made a LP with him. We made an LP in about 4 hours and 20 minutes. And we had no idea what he was going to play, or what he was going, there was no music. He'd tell the drummer to play me this beat. And he'd tell the bass player what to play. He's not red, you say, boom, dum, 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 boom, dum, 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 dum. Then he would have the drummer, you know, to fill up the rhythm, and the other horns and the guitar, he'd give you all your parts. And then we'd play that for maybe a couple of courses, then he'd change it around. So it would take us maybe, 20 minutes to get a song together. Then we'd record it. We'd play it twice, 3 times at the most. And that was it.
Great.
But I mean, he had all this in his head.
Yeah.
He knew what he wanted to do. He didn't have the music because he didn't know nothing about writing any music, but Bill Cosby played little drums. So he knew the rhythms and things.
He
and
could sing it.
And he could sing it.
Yeah.
And we recorded the whole album. Yeah.
I wonder if we could finish up with some suggestions to our viewers of what if we were going to go listen to some Red Holloway, what are some of your favorite recordings you've had?
I think my most favorite recording is I did an LP. The title of it was No Tears Over You. And all of these songs I wrote myself except for one, which was Art Hillary. He wrote one song on it. And the song No Tears, and then there was another song called Hitting the Road Again. Now, I went in the studio, well, we rehearsed it and played it on the job. Then we went in the studio and we cut it in about 3.5 hours, this album. Because I was paying, you see,
Yeah.
myself. So we ain't gonna be wasting no time here, fellas. If you got anything on your mind, speak now. I think that was my best album because, like, then there was a song titled "Music for Making Love." I wrote this song for a pornography film, but then I took the music for my own album because I liked it so much. But I think now there was one Clark Terry and I did called Locksmith Blues. My baby told me my key won't fit her lock no more. But I'm a master locksmith, mama. I got a key that'll fit any door, you know. Now that was one I wrote, and Clark really surprised me on that because the broad's name was, "Hey, Magnolia," and Clark was supposed to say something, but he answered in a woman's voice. He said, "What?" I said, "Huh?" Because I didn't know he was going to do that, you know.
Yeah.
And I think that was my best album because I did something I wanted to do, and
Right.
and between Locksmith Blues and No Tears Over You, I think those are my 2 best.
You know, I wanted to just make one comment about some of the things that you said and what you've been telling us about the blues lyrics and everything is that I sense in your music this marvelous sense of humor. Do you think we could have more of that in music today? I think music needs some of that to come back.
I think it would be nice to have some kind of sense of humor in your music, as well as seriousness when it comes to like playing, say like My Funny Valentine or something like that. You can really make a person feel like this is my Valentine. If you play like Love a Man, you want to get that same kind of feeling that Billie Holiday had because it was really something very unique and very few people are able to capture that type of feeling anymore. She just had that certain voice. And if you'll notice, there are certain people that come along maybe every 2 decades and they will have like Sarah Vaughan, like Billie Holiday, Nat King Cole. They have that certain something in their voices, you know, Ella Fitzgerald. There's just something that, there's another person that's alive now, that's still alive, Gloria Lynn. She's another that has that certain, you don't hear much about her. But they have, you know, like people can be talking, and if you got certain something, they'll stop talking and listen. Gene Ammons had that. He could do that, you know. So there's just I don't know what it is that's in the plan, but it works out that like when Coleman Hawkins came along, when Lester Young came along, Charlie Parker, John Coltrane. Now, I don't know, no one else has surfaced yet that's really an innovator like these people so far. They all followers and clones, but nobody at the moment is really doing nothing different. They all following his pattern, which I think that's the highest form of flattery, you know, when somebody want to do something like you do. But I'm just wondering, because all of the great people are dying. Billy Eckstine, all the real great voices, you know. So you just
know, that's one reason that we're doing these interviews. And we consider you one of those people that we wanted on tape very much so.
Oh, sure.
We want you to receive that as an honor.
Well,
we want to get your words.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's
great words.
That's a real beautiful compliment. I do thank you very much. But it's just something that Clark Terry, I talked to him on it. Now, one of our friends in Chicago, Lonnie Simmons, an organ player, used to work at this club. I was telling you about Club Delisa. He worked there for, I don't know, at least 30 years. He just died in February. So just so many people are dying, friends that we know who really had something to say. And like I think about Clark all the time because he's one of the last of the real heavyweights.
Clark Terry is being brought to our college in May
great.
to receive an honorary doctorate.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Let me tell you. I worked in Chicago New Year's with Clark, and I've been working with him on and off, you know, like whenever we can get a gig together. And this man is really a giver. He's not a taker. He's a giver. He's got this jazz institute in Iowa, the Clark Terry Jazz Institute at the Techio University in Lamars, Iowa. And I've taught a few classes there. In fact, I'm supposed to go there in June. But I do whatever I can for him. You know, I'll refuse a gig to work with him because of the fact that he's a giver. And being an only child, and, you know, I've always been a giver. My mother taught me, like, don't always have your hands out. Reach in your pocket and give somebody something if you got something, you know. So that's the way I feel. I guess that's why I'm poor today, because I give it all away. But, you know, I ain't seen nobody eat $1 yet.
Yeah. That's great. I want to thank Red Holloway for sharing all these great thoughts with us. And you said some things today that I think ought to be written down and recited to some great quotes.
Well, thank you very, very, very much. But these are as I see them. And thank you for having me. And I do thank you very, very, very much. And I hope to see you all again sometime soon, just in your own colleges or universities, you know, just as a visitor or whatever.
We'll be listening tomorrow morning to you, too.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah. I better get a good night's sleep tonight.
Well, most of our interviews will be over, and we're just going to come tomorrow just to listen.
Oh, okay, then. That's beautiful. Right. Well, I want to thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, baby, let me tell you what it's all about, yeah. Well, baby, let me tell you what it's all about. I'm a master locksmith, mama. Ain't a lock been made that can keep me out.